Just for everyone in the room, I have turned the recording on now. So if you don't want to have your picture captured on camera, then please turn the camera off. Yeah. How many people do we have?
17.
Oh,
18.
wait 1 minute. Hi, Gabby. I've started the recording.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Okay, I'll make a start now. I'd like to very much welcome everyone to this CIMR debate in public policy. This debate is on generative AI tools for organizations, both the benefits and the challenges. And I'd like to specifically thank Saverio, Romeo, for organizing this event. Saverio is lecturer at the University of Westminster. He also lectures at Birkbeck, and he is the founder of Emerging Technology Observatory. Before handing over to Saverio, I'd like to snatch a little bit of time and introduce to you our upcoming events. On the 13th of March, we have an event on cultural knowledge exchange, which is organized by our Deputy Director, Federica Rossi. And on the 20th of March, we have another online debates in public policy entitled The Missing Link, which is about models in moving diversity and inclusion policies into sustainable working practices with entrepreneurial ecosystems. And this event is organized by our director, Helen Lawton-Smith, together with Jacqueline Winstanley. So without further ado, Saverio, I hand over to you, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marion. Thank you, everyone, to be here at lunchtime. Thank you for the speakers. I mean, the idea of these. Sorry, it's jumping. Okay, the idea of this of the seminar of this webinar, it kind of started in a conversation in university about what do we do with generative AI tools when students are using it. So as that really simple start, and then we went into the discussion that it's probably a good idea to embrace those tools in order to also to tell students how to use them critically, because they will be inevitably part of their working life. So and the debate started from there, and where we are really here. So we are in a state of we do not really know much about these generative AI tools. We listened to it, we heard all about it, but we do not have a clue. So the idea is today is a kind of, you can if you want, it's a sort of lecture to a certain extent, because we have three experts that they will tell us about generative AI, and the idea is to ask them not just to tell what it is, but how it is used, and what are the limitations and the challenges that organizations are facing into in using those tools. So the speakers are the following, and this is the order too, and I'll explain why there is this order. So there is Dr. Paul Nulty from the School of Computer Science and Mathematics at Birkbeck. And Paul has the harsh task to tell us what these generative AI tools are in a simple way. You know, he's a computer scientist and AI scientist, but I told him, you know, we are ignorant here, and you need to be very low level in explain to us what generative AI tools are. And he will do that in 15 minutes, as I said many times to them. Then there is Shazad Jameson. I work with her in several projects. She's from Technopolis Group, which is a policy consultancy company, we can say like that. and she's an expert on AI for governments and public sector in particular. She will tell us about how public sector and governments are using these tools, or they want to use it. Then we have the experience of using those tools in teaching with with Andrew Hatter. I mean, you know Andrew because he's a visiting fellow here, probably, apart from being lecturer in entrepreneurship and innovation, Andrew, if I'm not mistaken, Oxford Brookes University in Manchester. So this is the order. Let's say Paul will tell us all. Shaz and Andrew will tell us about the experience, how they use it, what problems there are. And then we will have space for some discussion, some questions, and also just 1 second more is that this is for us also a starting point in terms of research, because we are trying to do some research on generative AI. So, you know, we try to get a bit more of insights also in terms of our research questions and directions from this event. So a great responsibility to our speakers. Anyway, thank you so much for this. I'll stop sharing. I'll give Paul the floor. 15 minutes for Paul, 50 minutes for Charles, 50 minutes for Andrew. I will be very bad. Don't go over, and do not hate me if I stop you. Thank you. Please, Paul.
Thank you,
Can
Saverio.
you? Oh, that's fine, Paul. Everyone can go mute so we do not have background noise, and the speaker has peace. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for inviting me, Saverio. I'll do my best to condense, obviously, what's a very complex and multifaceted and very fast-changing as well topic in a little time. So I'll just get started so I don't have more time. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about the history of AI, in particular natural language processing, which is my focus, because I think the history is very interesting and relevant to the present too. Then I'll do some quick examples of the degree of progress that we've made, although you're probably already familiar with quite a lot of the impressive things we've seen some systems in the last couple of years. Then I'll go over some brief technical points. Obviously, I don't have time to do any technical detail, but you can take what you're interested in from it. And then a little bit, although I'll leave this to the organization experts, but I'll mention some potential impacts on organizations. Okay, so this is a picture of Noam Chomsky, who basically founded almost the modern field of theoretical linguistics. And Chomsky based his theory of language on the manipulation of linguistic symbols by rules, not on any conception of statistics or probability of words or sentences. And he was very, very strident about this, to the degree of ending up describing the successes there have been as an approximation. It's novel in the history of science in that it interprets success as approximating unanalyzed data. And some people would still say that even given the success we have, that is still in effect what we were doing, approximating unanalyzed data. The other side of this, which is also very often brought up, is that in practical terms, trying to inject theory or what we sometimes call inductive biases into these systems, in other words, trying to build human-like knowledge into them from the start, has in historical terms not been as effective in terms of the performance of linguistic systems. There's this famous quote from IBM, and there's a very good essay on this by a researcher from Stanford and Google, Peter Norvig, about Chomsky and the two cultures of statistical learning. I just thought it was funny that the headline when I found this image was this Wired headline from 2012, which I think encapsulates how we sort of both overhype and underestimate where things are going, in that it sees phones getting much smarter. We tend to imagine that things will become much more effective in the way that they are, rather than seeing the complete transformation that can be coming. And this idea that building in theory into these engineering systems doesn't work very well, and it's more effective to rely on large amounts of computing power and data, has become known as the bitter lesson from this essay by a computer science professor from Alberta. The bitter lesson is that building in how we think does not work in the long run. And this has been very, very just true in historical terms. There is a curve of the amount of available data and compute and the performance on various AI benchmarks, and it goes up just like Moore's law goes up. And the maybe a nice analogy that's sometimes used here is to think of how useful is it for us to base the machines we build that fly, airplanes, off our knowledge of natural flight, birds. So there are arguments both ways from that analogy, but I think it can be a useful analogy. And I haven't included anything about generating images in the rest of this talk, but some of the images here, including this one, are made by Dolly or Midjourney. And the one thing I'd say about images is that we're moving much closer to real-time video generation as well as image generation. That's not far away. Okay, so moving on to how it's going and some of the more impressive tasks that we can now do. So I've chosen this example because I think it shows a good combination of the different capabilities of these systems, in this case, GPT-4. I will say if you don't have a GPT-4 or ChatGPT Plus subscription, there is a significant difference. If you're interested in these systems, I think it's less than £20 a month. It probably is worth at least trying it for a month. And there are a few extra features. The app, you can engage with it by speech and by uploading images. I've chosen this example, which is fantasy football, because I gave the input to this question by taking a photo of my laptop screen on my phone using the ChatGPT app, uploading it. As you can see, it's not a very good photo. It's blurry, names are barely visible, but ChatGPT is able to read it no problem. It can understand the information and link it back to things that have already been trained on. I can paste in an unformatted list, just bare text pasted in of all of the prices of the players in the games, and then ask it questions about my team, and it will make relatively informed suggestions. Part of the way it does this is something called retrieval augmented generation, which means these systems now can, as well as using their pre-trained data, query other databases and the internet in real time. So ChatGPT can look up information from sporting websites, for example, to learn which player is likely to start a particular game. And this example also contains an interesting failure case. Very often we see the cases where these models get it wrong is where it requires detailed logical, arithmetic, or symbolic reasoning. Now, they are capable of very impressive things with logical reasoning, but that does tend to be where their failure modes are. And the failure mode in this particular example was that I have a budget, and I'm not sure if this particular example adds up, but in my conversation with ChatGPT here, it consistently failed to add up the individual prices of the players to stay under the budget. And sometimes it even realizes that by the end of its own answer. It will give you all these players that add up to 120 million. And in the last part of the answer, it will say, unfortunately, that's more than you asked for. So that's, again, part of the way that these systems kind of reason in real time as they produce the output. So it's a common kind of what they call hallucination mode sometimes. Another recent impressive use is to be able to have a natural language interface to a particular source of information. So recently, the economist Tyler Cowen published a book about the history of economics in traditional form, but also as a GPT, where you can, rather than reading the book, I suppose, or as well as reading the book, ask it questions that are focused on the information in the book. And it uses the pre-trained language model as well as the fine-tuned model on this book for its overall knowledge base. And then you can ask it about the book in natural language. And finally, you might have heard a lot about the coding examples. So this is an example. So let me back up a little bit here. So OpenAI, as you may know, is through a complex corporate structure in a way owned by Microsoft. The details are very complicated and related to AI safety. The people who founded OpenAI We're concerned about the possibility of the risks of AI, all the various forms that you're probably heard about, that those risks come in, and they're concerned that the race to build the most effective AI will overlook these safety concerns. So they build a corporate structure which limits the profits of the owners, although they're limited to a very large amount. And the recent corporate struggle in OpenAI makes it unclear to what extent those concerns, those corporate structures, will actually in practice hold up. But the reason I've gone through all that there is because Microsoft also own GitHub, which is, I expect, the largest database of code in that exists. So it's a repository where many companies and ordinary coders store their code, and they also, Microsoft now also own the most popular development environment, the program used to write codes, the editor that the programmers use to write code, called VS Code. So they have attachments to all three of these businesses: the code editor, the code repository, and the AI company. So they've got all the resources available to train on a very large amount of code that they have access to, and also to provide real-time hints in the editor, in the same way that you sometimes get suggestions in Gmail or whatever to complete a sentence in your email. You can begin typing a header for a function, and if it's clear what the function is supposed to do, the code editor will suggest a completion. But this particular example I'm showing you here is in ChatGPT, and it's to show that you can describe quite a complex coding task. So in this case, counting variants of terms under heading categories in a directory of files where the year, which is a variable of interest, is encoded in the file, in the name of the file. It's probably about a 60-line solution. There's some complex data structures in it, a nested dictionary, and ChatGPT both outlines what it's going to do in natural language and produces the output. This is only a snippet, it's too large to fit on the screen. In this case, it worked right away for me. In my prompt, I had forgotten to specify a detail about white spaces in the words. I just described that detail to it in natural language, and it immediately fixed the code. So this is a very effective tool, and I found personally, I'm a computer science lecturer, and in my everyday work, it speeds up my coding a lot, especially in NLP. They have a lot of code examples already in NLP. Okay, so one final point that I forgot to include here in the slide, I just remembered before I came on, is I didn't mention voice or speech recognition, and this is an area where you may not have noticed that much progress, at least compared to the kind of natural language interface we've seen so far. But there is a very rapid progress being made now, both on speech recognition and speech generation. So if you've used speech recognition devices, even though they work very, very well, if you've got a particular accent or if you speak very quickly, it's not entirely natural, but that is still improving at a very fast rate. And also generating speech from text, which sounds pretty much flawless, and also imitating the voice of anyone which you have any length of recording of is possible. And the latest advance also is imitating a particular voice style just from a description of that voice. So you can tell it to generate the voice in a particular accent or and so on. So that's just one note on voice, which I forgot to include. So now just some technical points. Again, I can't cover, there's not really much I can do in this time, but there'll be some language that you'd be curious about that I can give a brief gloss of. So we're talking about generative AI rather than just AI. So what's particular about generative AI? Well, I suppose the oldest sort of AI, what we sometimes call GoFi, good old-fashioned AI or expert systems, encode knowledge as rules and explicit structure. Machine learning, AI is the statistical AI, trains a model on data and uses it to generate an output. So the type of machine learning classifiers that we might have generally been used to, like an email spam classifier, will train on some input text and then their output, the output of the pipeline or the weights will be values for a small number of outputs representing labels or categories. So we may have 2 outputs at the end, which represent spam or not spam, and they have values from 0 to 1, or just one output, 0 to 1 for spam or not spam. But generative AIs generate an output in the same form and scope as their output. So they encode the data from text by looking at patterns across the different inputs. I haven't mentioned transformers. There's just not enough time to go into everything, but the transformer was a key technical innovation for language especially, which is a type of neural network where the input looks at not just the immediate pairs of words or n-grams, but longer range dependencies among words in sentences and documents. And generative AIs encode their input like this, but then generate output in the same form and scope as their output. So the decoder reads out the encoded weights and continues the sequence of inputs in natural language, just like the input is natural language, or even going beyond its own input. So multimodal models can take in input in text and generate output in images, although obviously to do that there will have been some training data in both modes, so it's not a completely new mode. Some terms you may have heard in older AI systems, we talked about maybe training a system and testing it. The vocabulary is a little bit different with generative AI systems. We talk about training, pre-training, and inference. So what does this mean? Well, for the example of language models, the pre-training step involves taking a very, very large amount of text, a portion of all of the text that's on the internet. The model is basically trained to predict the next word, as you probably heard. It's a little bit more complex than that, but that is basically what's going on. And from this, the system learns the general rules of language. So it's not trained on any specific domain or any specific task. It's just trained to produce plausible, syntactically correct language. Now, here's where Chomsky would say it hasn't learned to produce all possible syntactically correct outputs, because that's not possible. It's pre-trained to produce likely ones given what it's seen, which tend to be syntactically valid to us and also semantically valid. And then, so we can pre-train a system on a large amount of text, and then we can do inference right away, just to get it to continue text with no particular direction. But usually we do some fine-tuning where we show it some particular examples of, say, emails and their labels, like this email spam, the next email not spam. So this is like the training phase where you show it the supervised data. And then the inference phase is where you run the system and get it to produce outputs on new data, new input. And a more recent advance is zero-shot learning or prompt tuning, where there is no fine-tuning step as such. You take a pre-trained system and you describe the task in natural language. So you literally tell the model in an ordinary sentence type prompt, I'm going to show you emails in JSON format, and I want you to label them as spam or not spam according to these criteria. And because it has such a broad knowledge of language, and through that, the meaning of the instructions you're giving it, this approach amazingly works quite well.
Paul, 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
That's okay. I think I'm on track. And then I've mentioned this already, just retrieval augmented generation is when the systems can, as well as using their pre-trained and fine-tuned weights to answer questions, in response to a query, retrieve documents from a database and read those documents in real time before giving an answer. Okay, so I'll leave this mostly to other speakers, but potential challenges for organizations. I think that everyday business writing and coding is already significantly disrupted, but these systems cannot do those tasks unsupervised. What they do well is the type of tasks that might take individual people, I think, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, depending on how good a coder you are. So you can maybe reduce these 45-minute, 30-minute tasks down to 5-10-minute tasks, which is very significant, but maybe less clear in terms of the impact on employment, which I'll come back to. The effects on long-term planning and reasoning are not really clear yet. I don't think we're there yet, but it is very early and progress doesn't seem to be slowing. And there's particular challenges for assessment in education and hiring. So for me, it's already possible for second-year undergraduate exams, certainly, to take a screenshot of many of the papers and instantly have answers, which is very, very challenging for assessing education, and I assume for hiring as well. Yeah, so and just some of my own opinions on this. I would say don't become overly polarized about whether AI systems truly understand or have consciousness. This is a very polarized debate. It's often linked to people's strong opinions on statistical versus good old-fashioned AI. I think there are, important points to both. There are limitations to the purely statistical systems, but those are currently the most successful. In terms of employment, I think the historical precedent suggests that there are many current roles that can be badly damaged or cut out by this type of technology, but in the long run, it hasn't been bad for employment overall. There probably aren't fewer accountants because of Excel or accounting software and things like that. I don't know. It's complex in different cases. I've already mentioned that the amount of data and compute is at the moment probably the determining factor in how fast we progress. But I do think that statistical approaches are necessary but not sufficient on many tasks, particularly the systems that Google built for Go, chess, and protein folding. Those all relied on hybrid systems that combine tree search with deep neural networks. So in many areas, hybrid systems with symbolic and statistical approaches are the best. Okay, I'm finished.
Lovely, thank you, Paul. Applause to Paul. Yes, if you can stop sharing, Paul, and don't run away because I'm sure we have a lot of questions. And Charles, can you share your slides? Thanos, later. Stay on, don't go.
You should see my screen now.
Yes, please, Charles.
Great. Let me start my timer. Hi, everyone. So my name is Chance Jameson. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. As Saverio mentioned, most of my experience has been in digital transformation of the public sector. So this is really where my insights are coming from, but I'll try to tailor them also for educational and entrepreneurial contexts. And change slide. Great. So what I think is really interesting about Gen AI is that it's two things at the same time. It's both incredibly exciting, particularly with like all of the capabilities that have come out in the last, since end of 2022, early 2023. And it's also rather boring. ChatGPT is the fastest growing app of all time. It had, there we go. It had 1 million users within 5 days, which is unheard of until now. And yet, in the way that we see generative AI being used right now in most organizations, they're for quite mundane tasks. It's things like textual analysis and summaries. It's things like reporting, writing emails, writing memos. These are all very important parts of work, but it's a different quality of work than if we're thinking about surrealist art rendering and real-time video generation. So it's important to keep in mind what are we discussing. And it's a really nice segue after Paul's talk, because I actually have an example that really links from what he was talking about. And this is an example that comes from Technopolis, the consultancy that I'm currently working with, on a generative AI model that was used, that has been developed for European Commission DG Regio industrial policy. This is S3. which is the Smart City Specialization Strategy. And essentially, it's creating a corpus, a database of all of the regional policies, and creating a layer that is essentially easier to read, easier to update every quarter, and easier to identify trends and build connections across different regions. I won't get too technical. You will see that it does have some of the zero-shot classification that Paul was talking about. But essentially, the policy priorities were identified manually beforehand. And then this was put into kind of a text modeling to identify where these priorities came out, which was then created into paragraphs and identifying keywords and creating a taxonomy of these keywords to make this database of European industrial policy easier to navigate. Importantly, there is a human in the loop. There's a human reviewer that checks and reads over how this is done to detect hallucinations, correct gaps, and rectify misclassifications. So you need, as Paul said, you can't have these systems run unsupervised. You really need somebody to keep an eye on it. Now, this example comes from the policy context. It simplifies the work of working on policies because it's sorting through these reams of text. But at the end of the day, somebody still needs to decide and make the policy. It's only a tool to supplement that work. You still need somebody to make that decision, look at what are the patterns that have emerged, and anything that needs to change, develop new policy, redirect. That's not where Gen AI is going to support you. And it's important to make that difference. We can't just say, well, it's gonna do our work for us. That's not how it works. I also think it's interesting to comment on a social aspect, which is that where we are now, as an important caveat, a lot of people are using ChatGPT. Most people are not paying for the extra subscription. So it's usually GPT-3. And it's really common. I mean, I've seen emails. I've seen juniors using it to draft first drafts for webinar agendas. And as a reader, when I get an email that I can tell that it's been written with ChatGPT, it changes my perception of that email conversation. It's a little bit overly formal. It's a little bit overly complicated. It's less personal, and that doesn't mean it's a good or a bad thing, but I recognize it, and it changes how I feel. So I think in the work that you do as an organization, you need to consider, does that matter to you? And if so, why? What is really fascinating about Gen AI is that it is reducing the barriers to a lot of technical skills. So like Paul mentioned with coding and Copilot, but also visual rendering, computer-generated images, like taking a pencil sketch and putting it into GPT and having it come out with a photorealistic image, doing the work of writing, and also multilingualism. I mean, this has gotten phenomenally better. We've had translations for quite some time, but now I think it becomes much more realistic to do business across borders in a way that wasn't as easy before. So this is, in general, fantastic. What it means is that we need to build training and capacity building to allow that progress to happen. Specifically, training needs to be adaptive and agile. What I mean by that is that you cannot have a training which is just based on one particular tool because the tools are evolving so fast. It's also important that whatever training we develop recenters our sense of agency, and that it is your responsibility to identify what is the output that you want from that model. We can't, there is no computer said no, or the algorithm told me so. It's, you really have a strong role to shape what that tool is going to identify for you. And because it's still so exploratory, I think it's very important that when we are considering training, that this is not an isolated drop-in event, but that it is part of a environment that cultivates exploration. And that's an attitude, it's an approach, but it also means space and time to explore, try out, tinker, make mistakes. And if you're in an environment where everything is urgent all the time, that's can be kind of counterproductive. We've also briefly alluded to some of the risks. I think these are not necessarily specific to generative AI, but I really think it's important to mention. The challenge with automation and increasingly integrating automation into the way that we work in our everyday, into the mundane tasks of our everyday, is that we risk making the choices that we are making invisible. And this is a form of depoliticization, which is really problematic. And the risk is to amplify already existing biases within institutional cultures. So if you're unfamiliar, I'm in the Netherlands. I'm here, the Dutch childcare benefit scandal. If you haven't heard of it, it's the reason that algorithmic accountability is a national public debate. And I think last year or the year before, the government had to resign. And essentially what happened is that the Dutch tax authority was using an algorithm to identify fraud. And it demanded something like 26,000 parents. It identified them as fraudulent on their social welfare, and demanded instant repayment of several thousands of euros for families who are already in precarious socioeconomic backgrounds. And it turns out that the algorithm was using non-Dutch ethnicity as an indicator for fraud. So essentially, the algorithm was racist. It reflected a racist institutional culture. But this went unattended to. And I think this is where, when we start to automate our processes without being thoughtful about what are we automating, it becomes really important. So practically, what can you do? If you have a problem to solve, I'm thinking real world problems rather than mathematical. If you work in a city, if you have a business, if you're thinking about a user issue, and you're considering using AI and generative AI, look at responsible AI approaches. That should be your starting point. This is a huge field. I place an image here of a report that I co-authored with UN Habitat and the Mille Quebec AI Institute, which has a really great, risk management framework, which looks at kind of the AI lifecycle. It was pioneering at the time. There's a couple of them that are out there now. That's great. Risk management frameworks start from the decision that you're going to use AI, and they're contained within that AI lifecycle. However, for most social problems, there's actually an enormous period of time beforehand where you're still deciding, are we going to use AI, yes or no? And is actually generative AI the most useful thing for what we want to achieve? So we're problem-centered rather than technology-focused. And in some of the most successful, specifically machine learning examples that I've seen, problem definition was something that lasted like 6 months in terms of using machine learning for urban applications. It's an enormous chunk of time, and in general, most people don't give enough time, space, or budget to do this successfully. At the end of the life cycle, if you do risk management frameworks, usually where you end up with is a kind of matrix of actions that are high impact and easy to do, and what should you do next. And usually the high impact, most valuable, but most difficult things to do are public engagement. If you are a public authority, This means citizen and resident engagement, which we know is very difficult and very time consuming. If you are a business looking at your clients, this usually means market research and client engagement, which a lot of businesses consider this to be too costly and then actually don't end up, just kill the project and don't end up doing it. The other thing that I'll say, and this is going to be one of my last slides, is that any organization in general, I think the disruption that generative AI poses is really a spark. It's really a moment of interest to reflect on our data governance strategy, because a lot of these questions that we're asking of like, what should we do, can be reframed when we're working through what is our strategy for data governance. By that, I mean power structures, both in terms of like a data governance review board, but also the type of infrastructure and digital infrastructure that you may be using or reliant on. Procurement is a very interesting area, particularly for public organizations, because it changes the accountability relationships that we depend on. It's one thing to say, well, the model I'm using made a mistake, and it's another thing to say it's the contractor's fault because we bought this model from them. And at what stage do you, as an organization, remain accountable, and when can you make those explainability claims? So I think procurement clauses are a very interesting area, but okay. Decision making, who and how that happens, who is involved and who is invited to speak. Procedures for data management. On one hand, user experience. So a lot of data governance strategies is like, where do you go for information and what should you do next? Both as a client or as a citizen or resident, but also as somebody who works within the organization. And one thing I very briefly wanted to mention is we've been looking at using generative AI tools, and one of the questions that comes up being in the Netherlands and Belgium is like, well, this tool is GDPR friendly. And the GDPR was, in part, it's intended to allow for cross-border data transfers. It's not intended to solve a lot of accountability issues that you might be facing. So we need to go beyond that that moniker. But in general, I encourage having a plan and a strategy for what do we want to do and why, beyond looking at just that one piece of technology. And mindful that I'm at the Center for Innovation Management, I would love to just add a final note that I think the real changes, the big game changers, are going to be looking at change management and relational intelligence within people in the organization. So I will leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Shaz. Applause to you too. Andrew, Gabriela, can you share the slides?
Yes. Can you see the screen?
I think it's coming up. It's coming. Yes, we can. Please, Andrew, all yours.
Thank you very much, Saverio, and great to be here. And thank you, Gabriela, for mounting the slides there. So I hope everyone can see that. Very interesting so far, and I'll try and build on what Paul and Shazada has put out for us already. Some very interesting comments. I'd just like to perhaps get into perhaps much more of the applied areas and just pick up some themes and show how some of the things we've talked about already can actually show up in practice. So I'll be straight into this. I've actually titled this Creative Destruction in the Classroom. And from that, you could talk about any meeting room or any boardroom or any collection of groups of people communicating with each other, because I think we are going to go through a fundamental transformation of how we interact in groups, whether it be classroom, lecture theatres or whatever. And I think that will be a social revolution. So the sort of social innovation around that, I think, is going to be probably more important necessarily than specific technologies. I'll try and explain what I mean by that. Gabrielle, if we can perhaps move on to the next slide. If we look in,
sorry, just bear with me. I think it's up.
Yeah,
there you go.
There we go. Yeah, so here we go. So just a problem statement. The despite all the technology, despite the billions invested in lecture theatres and improved infrastructure and online learning technology, up until 2022, I think it flattened out in 2023, but the overall student satisfaction in teaching is going down, not up. That's possibly raised expectations, but also to do with perhaps an increasingly intolerant view students have towards what I would delicately call mediocre or variable lecturing, i.e. lecturers standing at a podium delivering fairly standardized, it doesn't happen at Birkbeck, but this goes on everywhere else, but very standardized information that probably could be delivered more efficiently and better in other ways. Therefore squeezing out time for the kind of interactive Q&A that students enjoy and possibly may actually lead to higher engagement. So this is a real issue. Now, as Saverio mentioned, I teach on the Manchester campus at Oxford Brookes University, very much a widening participation initiative. I teach mostly students who come from a background where they have failed in education or education has failed them. How we see it, they're adult learners coming back into education often for, perhaps with gaps of 10 or 15 or more years. Some of them traumatized by education, to be fair. So we're having to rethink how we deliver what may to classic students in, say, a Russell group be fairly standardized, and sitting there listening for 45 minutes, for example, is something that many of our students simply can't do, not able to do it. There's also a question whether they should be doing that. So so that's the backdrop around, perhaps widening participation is exactly the demographic also most threatened by AI from a employment point of view. So learning how to use it in the classroom both is, I see as a potentially huge creative opportunity for rethinking the classroom and educational experience. It's also a way of embedding employability skills into the educational experience. So they might be writing or working on Joseph Schumpeter, but they're also, by the way, learning how to manipulate and use AI and the related tools that we now have available. So there is a potential double benefit. There are downsides too. So Gabrielle, if we can move on, thank you very much. So yeah, this is just a brief, this is hopefully if I can take a 30-second snippet at the end, we could perhaps play a little bit of this video, but it's the synthetic avatars have arrived. They are strikingly and creepily lifelike. And to pick up a very important point Paul said about need to refine the script. When I'm working with video like this, you do have to work on grammar, cadence, emphasis, pronunciation. You simply can't dump a lot of text and the video generating lifelike images and speech. But it is, we now can deliver engaging content at far lower cost. Synthetic avatars don't get stuck on trains. They don't take holidays, and they can be edited and changed in a second. And that's that is an advantage. So if you're constantly updating content and you want to, or perhaps vary content between different classes, for example, and duplicate and all those things, we've got that technological scalability for educators, which we've never had before. Thanks, Gabrielle. If we can move on. So there are, so one of the big things, and it's really worth emphasizing, synthetic avatars, like the convergence between education design, learning design, and gaming design effectively presents us with a real opportunity. One of the striking things about research is people learn from human faces. So you might ask, well, why not just learn? Why don't you just present slides and have a voiceover, for example, on some PowerPoint slides? It's perfectly acceptable. Well, the reason is that we learn most and we most engage when we're seeing a human face or face-like people talking to us. And this is what synthetic avatars can do. So there is plenty of research emerging, I say plenty, some research emerging that says, the level of attention, for example, if we are being given content is higher than if we simply look at static slides. More of that later. So thanks, Gabriella. We'll move on to the next slide. But that's an important consideration. Also, just quickly, synthetic avatars can work well with the kind of animation and timing as your content slide.
Sorry, Andrew, did you want me to?
No, that's fine. That's fine. This is the AI synths work well with animation and synchronization. Yeah, is that okay? Everyone see that?
Yes.
That's fine. So the animation can work well with the synthetic characters in terms of timing, and that can just mean we can present pre-packaged content in ways that are more entertaining and engaging than we ever could with static slides, which have to be read. Okay, thank you, Gabriella. The next slide up. We can. Yeah, so what I did in the classroom to confront this is a live project to do with students. So I was faced with presenting IT essentials. You'll be pleased at this scenario that I've been lecturing in IT. So this was a challenge. We teach in 5-hour blocks, and we had two 5-hour blocks to teach. So I was confronted with dozens of slides covering techno securities and GDPR and all the rest of it. This is a shock to some, but this is not terribly interesting to many people. So it's essential information. So how to get this across in a way that's sort of creative and entertaining. So what I did was, rather than present the slides, I said, look, use ChatGPT. This information is entirely generic. Most of this, not all of it, obviously, but the information they needed to get was entirely reachable through generic standardized content. So I got them into teams, got them working on using ChatGPT 3.5, the free version, got them to edit a script and then put the script into Synthesia synthetic avatars. Played around with that, see what worked. They had to edit that script further when they saw how that was playing out with voices and so on. They changed the characters to make them look like people they knew or their father or mother or whatever, and had some fun with that. And then played the videos back. So the whole process was a creative process. They owned it. Yes, they had to check sources. Yes, they had to quote sources and cite and so on and prove references. And in fact, that was part of the check. Is we could then focus on where that information came from and what was missing and how we know certain things. And that was actually the more important part of the debate, right? So rather than just going through sort of standardized content, and we had a lot of fun. So they would have left the classroom very proud of what they did, leave the classroom proud of what they did, and they had fun. And the retention of that information, my assumption, this has not been researched, but my assumption is, would have been far higher than if I had simply in a very standardized monotone voice presented 5 hours of GDPR slides. Right, they were saved from that. So I think there are lots of things we can do to move content and get students working on this creatively. This is a classroom exercise. I don't think it can be used in formative and summative exercises, but for classroom activities which can basically bring them up to a certain level of moderate awareness of content, I think it can work fine. So yeah, thanks, Gabrielle. If we can move on. So yeah, this was also a podcast which we put together where students were looking at various case studies. This is an important thing. We talked about text. I think you mentioned this, Paul. I think an increasingly important emerging issue will be the creative use of images, because DALL-E was used here to generate this podcast logo. So students will come and talk about scandals. We've talked about various Sam Bankman-Fried and all the great scandals we've had recently, and they've been generating a lot of that image. Again, all of that is available through ChatGPT, but the use of images, and this is so ChatGPT has interpreted words and created an image around that. Now that's a very powerful tool to have. We can see that coming. So if we move on to the next slide, Gabrielle, try and finish up very quickly. So I had some fun. I thought, well, create an image showing how traditional formal education is being subject to creative destruction, aka Joseph Schumpeter, by AI, opening up crazy possibilities and new ways of learning. So this is the image it came up with. I'll just leave this with you. It's horrifying. I don't think many people would want to see young adults being subjected to this kind of thing, but that's what it came up with. So it's there. There's an apple there. So there's some positivities to take away. So obviously but the interpretive nature of these graphics becomes quite an important thing, and I think a potential asset to be used in projects, be they consultancy projects or educational projects. But not least, what do you think of this? You could play it back to a classroom or back to a group of exec ed participants or whatever and say, what does this tell you? And then negotiate with and interrogate ChatGPT to come up with images that might be different or better than this one. Okay, moving on. So this is another image, so we can move past this. Academic standards are still have to be maintained, and I think we can use this to reinforce things like, where did that information come from? It was a real learning to say, well, how, what is plagiarism and how can we test the knowledge that we're getting from ChatGPT? And I think citation referencing, academic writing, and those things should be unaffected in the main body of papers that get presented in formatives and summatives. So next slide, Gabriella, thank you. But oh, by the way, SPAG is appalling. Yeah, so ChatGPT can't spell. So the main key point I would say is since free up faculty to coach in the classroom. That's what I would like to see. AI Synths can deliver preparatory learning, but it's good enough good enough standard to cover the generic and standard theories and models. There's lots of information out there that can be used without plagiarism. And there's a lot of orphan material out there. So Synths can use that. It can free up time, and it can be improved. And there are certain types of students, certain types of learning needs, those who perhaps have trouble sitting and concentrating in classrooms, who would naturally benefit from both seeing better avatar-based content with human faces, and also being involved in the creative process in which knowledge is put together and edited and created, and they're part of that, rather than being subject to being told things through traditional PowerPoints from didactic teachers like me at a podium. So I think there's a real shift going on, and I think we should think far more creatively than we have done. There's been a lot of problematizing, and there are problems, but there are plenty of creative options out there. And this is kind of helping students learn how to use this material wisely. I think that's the last slide. I think, Gabrielle.
Great, Andrew.
Yeah,
that's the last fun.
I will create my mom's avatar for my students. Shaz needs to leave, I believe. Oh, are you still there, Shaz?
I do, unfortunately.
Yeah, okay. You do not have the time for a question. You need to leave it.
If it's a quick one, we can do it. Let's go.
Come on, a quick one for Shaz. Very quick one. There was one in the chat, I think. Let me see if I can find it. Don't be shy. Where is he? Where is he?
I'd made a comment about economic and cost drivers on use of AI. I think that was the question I just want to dive in. Just because you were alluding to the fact that the risk is if politicians see AI as a very fast driver on cutting costs and the social consequences of that. So just be interested to get your thoughts on that.
I'm not sure, to be honest with you. Ooh.
Wait. Can you try again, Shaz?
How about now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure, but I think that sounds like a larger conversation. So why don't we connect bilaterally for that?
Sure. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah.
Gladly. Saverio, you're muted.
Shaz, you have a call at 2:30 sharp, you said?
I'm going to need to excuse myself, but thank you so much, everyone. This has been fantastic. Bye.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Bye-bye. Any other questions for the other two? Andrew, what do I find the Synth AI stuff?
There's a company called Synthesia, which is they produce a lot of best known, I think, for customer service applications. So when you go and buy some insurance, you'll get some very rigid, standardized synth telling you about the 3 options you have. And that's where it's stuck. But I think we can use them for educational purposes. But it's called Synthesia.
Synthesia. SYNTHES.
And I think it's I think it's .ai. I think, I'm not sure, but it's Synthesia is the company, and there are others, but they are reasonably accessible. And they, because I do a lot of this work, I mean, I pay £80 a month for a subscription for that, and so it's not hugely expensive. I mean, it's not, it's obviously I get it back because I do a lot of exec ed work, but it's not for an institution. It's not an extortionate amount of money to put for that kind of computing power.
Okay, I know it's 2:31. Thanos, yes, please.
Yeah, thanks, Saverio. And thanks, Paul and Andrew, for very interesting presentations. I got a bit nostalgic when I saw Paul's slides because he's using LaTeX, I think, the software. And I used to use that, and now I'm forced to use PowerPoint. So, Paul, you brought nice memories back. So I have to go back home and again, like, prepare my...
I think he dropped. After praising LaTeX, he dropped. Any other questions? I know it's 2:32. Maybe just a quick one for our 2 remaining panelists. Otherwise, I have a query. Yes, go ahead. Do you want me to read the query? I know. Oh, Thanos is back.
Sorry,
Thanos,
sorry, my internet connection. Now well, I was talking about LaTeX, but now when I think about AI, I see it more like AI enhanced by digitalization or artificially intelligent digitalization. I don't see it as a technological revolution. I see it more like a continuation of digitalization, a more advanced version. And then I think we inherited a lot of the issues from digitalization, like privacy issues that we didn't address 20 years ago. And now AI is there and raising those ethical questions. But my question to both Paul and Andrew is inequalities, because that's what I'm interested in. Yeah. And I think the focus on AI when it comes to the economic impact is on unemployment, technological unemployment. We're all scared that our jobs were replaced by a robot somehow. But I think we neglect the question of inequalities. And my question is, what do you think AI would increase or decrease inequalities? And referring to economic and social inequalities, would several groups of people, marginalized people, will fall behind because they're excluded from the AI discourse? And we had also Sazed brought as example of racism in the Netherlands. So my question is, what do you think about AI and the link to inequality?
Yeah. Who do you want to go on that, Paul?
I can go. I don't have much to say. I mean, maybe it's a question for an economist more, but I think that there is a history of productivity enhancing tools increasing inequality in that way, because for some types of jobs, one person's labor for a set amount of time tends to give the same amount of output, whereas with advances in productivity tools, there can be a multiplier effect on productivity. So yes, I think that is one of the biggest dangers, although you can argue the degree to which that has already happened with programming. I think maybe it hasn't been as bad as some people thought, but I do think it's a real effect.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's two potential divergent effects. One is, I think, in terms of geography. So, I mean, in the short to medium terms, you could see, for example, in the UK, jobs being created in London, Southeast, around AI and that's obviously connected with investment and where the startups and universities are, and versus the Northwest here, for example, Scotland, are those places where we know that because of the education system, people have less resilience to, and they're working in jobs that are much more easily automated and have got less educational resources and social capital to fall back on. That's why I think, so that's one thing. I think the other way is time as well, because I think will be an issue of, it might be you'll get a new job created for you, but that might be in 5 years, or is it in 6 months? So there's a time factor here as well. Some people will see the benefits quickly, others will see the benefits only in years to come. So that's why I think it's urgent that we address the getting hands-on. Now, I think enabling those who are, say, for example, a widening participation background, those people who don't have strong educational qualifications or career capital, that they've got access and know how to use these tools effectively, so they can boost their employability. They're not excluded from them. So my concern would be, for example, ChatGPT-4 is quite pricey. If I think £18 a month and so on, it's quite expensive if you're not getting an economic recovery for that. And obviously, you're on a lower income, you're not going to pay for that. Now, we have to find a way in society of saying we should find people who have employment threatened to get their hands on ChatGPT-4 and 5 and later versions, so that they can find ways of enhancing their employment capital. Can't be too difficult to do that. We're not really thinking enough about it. There is a net job creation, but the thing is that the jobs that are created won't necessarily be in the right places or the right time. And in the interim, we have I think it is a race against time, because if we don't, we're going to find large tracts of our country and the world generally locked out because of firewalls and subscription fees. And that's a fairly horrifying prospect, because they've already got enough to deal with. So, yeah, I think totally valid point, Thanos. Yeah.
Thank you all. Ellen, maybe you want to give us some closing words?
Yes, well, thank you, Saverio, and thank you to Paul, Andrew, and Charles for speaking, and for people attending. As you can see, that we're just beginning to get warmed up in the dialogue. But I think when we do the blog and the recording, there's got to be scope for people responding to what they've heard, because I'm sure that this is a very early conversation between the three of you and Saverio, and we'd like to think of ways of taking that forward. So maybe the CIMR website is the medium for that. But yeah, fascinating events, 3 very different but very complementary presentations. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Gabby, for pulling it all together. And thank you, Marion. And we'll see you all next time on March the 13th. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks,
bye.
everyone. Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.